The rain had come and gone through Miami's afternoon skies, leaving the streets glossy and reflective beneath the setting sun. From the window of her small but sunlit apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, Sofia Martinez watched the fading storm clouds turn golden at their edges. She sat on the couch with a sketchbook open on her knees, the pages filled with delicate pencil renderings of room layouts, furniture concepts, and notes written in her careful handwriting. Her life these days revolved around that sketchbook. It was the one thing that made her feel whole again after the collapse of everything she once thought permanent. 3 months earlier, she had been engaged to Trevor Ashford, a rising executive at a luxury development firm. They'd been together for almost 5 years, and she had believed that finally, she was building both a career and a future. But what she had mistaken for partnership had been little more than control dressed in affection. Trevor liked the idea of being the successful man with a stylish designer fiancée, someone who looked good on his arm at corporate events but never outshined him. And when she began to attract her own clients, when her talent started drawing real attention, his compliments had turned into quiet criticisms, disguised as advice. "You're doing well, Soph," he would say with a patronizing smile, "but maybe stay in your lane. The big league clients aren't ready for you yet." When he ended things, it wasn't with honesty or compassion. He simply walked out of their shared condo one evening after an argument about her turning down a favor he'd arranged for her, a design contract with one of his friends that would have reduced her work to interior decoration for a high-end cigar lounge. "You're too emotional," he had told her. "Business requires thick skin. You'll thank me later." Then he was gone, taking the condo lease, most of their furniture, and what little self-confidence she still had left. Now she worked quietly from her apartment, taking small residential projects for clients who appreciated her attention to warmth and detail. It was honest work, and yet part of her still heard Trevor's voice every time she hit send on a client proposal, still doubting, still measuring herself by the shadow he had left behind. That was when her phone chimed. A new message from Rachel Kim, her closest friend since their university days. "Emergency brunch tomorrow. You need this. Dress cute." "I'm not taking no for an answer." Sofia smiled faintly. Rachel was the kind of friend who refused to let anyone drown quietly. She was dynamic, relentless, and always 3 steps ahead. Her marketing agency catered to elite clients in Miami's art and fashion world, and she'd been trying for weeks to pull Sofia out of her self-imposed isolation. The next morning, the two met at a cafe that overlooked the ocean. Rachel was already there, phone in hand, energy radiating from her in waves. "Okay," she said the moment Sofia sat down. "I have something that's going to blow your mind." Sofia raised a brow. "Please tell me it's not another one of your networking setups." Rachel grinned mischievously. "Better. My firm just landed a campaign with Ethan Vale. You know, the billionaire guy who owns Vale Industries? The one who builds luxury smart yachts." Sofia nearly choked on her coffee. Everyone in Miami had heard of Ethan Vale. He was a self-made tycoon, known not only for his brilliant engineering designs, but for his privacy. He rarely appeared in the gossip columns, and when he did, it was never for scandal. His company's new flagship yacht, the Solstice, had been in every design magazine for months. "He's hosting a private charity gala on the yacht next weekend," Rachel continued, lowering her voice dramatically. "I got 2 invites. One for me, one for you." Sofia blinked. "Rachel, that's insane." "That's not my world. Those events are for investors and celebrities." "Exactly," Rachel said, eyes sparkling. "Investors who own hotels, villas, resorts, the exact kind of people who need interior designers. This could be your chance to rebuild your client list. And don't you dare say no. You've been hiding too long. It's time to remind yourself who you are." Sofia wanted to protest. She could already imagine the scene. Glittering people in $1,000 dresses, champagne flutes held like accessories, conversations flowing with practiced ease. It was everything she had grown to despise during her years with Trevor. But Rachel's enthusiasm was contagious, and somewhere beneath the fear, a spark of curiosity flickered. "Fine," she said quietly, "but if I panic, we leave early." Rachel clapped her hands. "Deal. And you're not wearing that sad beige dress you always pick. I'm taking you shopping." The week flew by in a blur of fittings, fabric samples, and mounting anxiety. On the night of the event, Sofia stood in front of her mirror, almost not recognizing the woman reflected there. Her long, dark hair cascaded in soft curls over one shoulder, her emerald gown shimmering gently with each breath. Rachel had chosen it, insisting that green brought out the warmth in her skin and the fire in her eyes. The dress was elegant without being loud, its back open just enough to suggest confidence, not vanity. For the first time in months, Sophia felt beautiful. They arrived at the marina just as the last streaks of sunset painted the horizon. The solstice was impossible to miss. 200 feet of pure engineering marvel, its sleek white hull reflecting the golden light like liquid metal. The decks glowed with soft illumination, and the faint sound of live jazz drifted over the water. Guests moved elegantly across the gangway, laughter mingling with the sound of waves lapping against the docks. Sophia's breath caught as she stepped aboard. Every detail was perfection. Polished teak floors, curved glass railings, cascading floral arrangements in shades of ivory and gold. She could almost feel the thought and artistry behind the design, the way the space seemed to breathe. Rachel led her toward the main deck, weaving through clusters of guests. "You're in designer heaven, aren't you?" she teased. "I can't even describe it," Sophia whispered, her eyes wide. "This isn't just luxury, it's art." They hadn't been there 10 minutes when Rachel was swept away by a colleague, leaving Sophia momentarily alone. She wandered to the edge of the deck, letting the sea breeze brush her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt a hint of peace, until a familiar voice shattered it. "Well, this is unexpected." She froze. That smooth, self-satisfied tone could only belong to one person. Turning slowly, she found Trevor Ashford standing a few feet away, a glass of champagne in hand and the faintest smirk on his lips. Beside him was a woman Sophia didn't recognize, a tall brunette with sharp cheekbones and an expensive gown that clung to her like liquid silver. "Trevor," Sophia said, keeping her tone even though her stomach twisted. "Didn't think you'd be here." "Of course you didn't," he replied. "This is a little above your usual circle, isn't it?" His companion chuckled lightly, the sound cutting into Sophia's chest like glass. "I'm here as Rachel's guest," Sophia said calmly. "She's working with the host." Trevor swirled his drink lazily. That explains it. Rachel's always been ambitious. You two make quite the contrast. She climbs while you stay comfortable." Sophia's cheeks flushed. "You know you haven't changed," she said softly. "Still trying to make yourself taller by cutting others down." For a moment, his mask slipped. "Careful, Sophia. This isn't your little design blog crowd. These are serious people. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself." The words hit their mark. Around them, a few guests were glancing over, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. The old humiliation crept back, the same icy helplessness she had felt so many times before. She turned, intending to walk away, but another voice joined the conversation. "Mr. Ashford, I see your talent for condescension remains unmatched." The crowd subtly shifted as Ethan Vale himself approached, his presence commanding without effort. He was taller than Sophia expected, dressed simply in an open-collared white shirt and tailored navy trousers. Yet everything about him radiated quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. His blue-gray eyes lingered on Sophia for a fraction longer than politeness required, assessing, concerned. "Miss Martinez," he said gently. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Yes, thank you," she managed, her pulse racing. "Good," he replied, his gaze flicking back to Trevor. "I dislike witnessing rudeness on my vessel. It tends to spoil the atmosphere." Trevor's smirk faltered. "Mr. Vale, there's no problem here. Just old friends catching up." "Ah, yes," Ethan said evenly. "I remember you now. You're the consultant who suggested bypassing safety compliance in your proposal last quarter." His tone was mild, but the implication was razor-sharp. "I believe my office returned your documents with a note that read, 'Integrity is not optional.' Does that ring a bell?" The silence that followed was absolute. The brunette beside Trevor shifted uncomfortably. A few nearby guests exchanged amused glances. Trevor's face turned an alarming shade of red. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "You might find that arrogance impresses insecure men. It does not work on me." Then, turning back to Sophia, he added with a gentleness that made her heart stutter, "Forgive the interruption. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Sophia nodded, unable to speak. There was something in his expression, protective but respectful, that disarmed her completely. Ethan smiled faintly. then addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's keep our evening pleasant, shall we?" "Mr. Ashford, I believe you'll find the exit that way." Trevor sputtered. "This is absurd." "Not at all," Ethan interrupted quietly. "Just good manners." As security discreetly approached, the murmurs grew louder. Trevor's companion slipped away, pretending not to know him. For the first time since the breakup, Sophia felt something shift inside her. Not triumph exactly, but release. Trevor's power over her was gone, evaporating under the weight of his own pride. Ethan turned back to her once more. "You handled that with remarkable composure," he said softly. "I didn't really do anything," she replied, still shaken. "You stood your ground," he countered. "That's more than most." He paused, studying her face for a moment. "I'm told you're an interior designer. My team mentioned your name this week, actually. You have a reputation for creating spaces that feel lived in, real. That's rare in this city." Sophia blinked in surprise. "My work, you've seen it?" "A few photos," he said. "One in particular caught my attention, a coastal villa project with warm lighting and open textures." "You designed it?" "Yes," she said, almost whispering. "Beautiful work," he murmured. Then, lowering his voice just slightly, "If you're open to it, I'd like to discuss a potential collaboration. Something larger than you've done before." Her heart stumbled in her chest. Of course. I'd love to." "Good." He smiled again, a quiet curve of lips that somehow steadied her. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Miss Martinez. You've earned it." And with that, he walked away into the glittering crowd, leaving Sophia standing beneath the soft glow of the deck lights, her pulse thrumming with something she hadn't felt in months: hope. As the yacht drifted slowly beyond the marina lights, the city skyline fading behind them, Sophia leaned against the railing and exhaled. The humiliation that had haunted her for so long seemed to dissolve into the salt-scented air. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that this night, the one she'd dreaded so much, might just be the beginning of something extraordinary. The days that followed the yacht gala unfolded like a dream Sophia couldn't quite believe she'd lived through. It wasn't only because of the public humiliation that had turned into an unexpected moment of redemption. It was the calm, commanding presence of Ethan Vale that lingered in her thoughts. His words, his composure, the way he had effortlessly silenced Trevor without raising his voice. It had left an imprint on her. Not romantic, not yet, but something that touched the part of her that still believed in integrity, in quiet strength, in kindness that didn't need to announce itself. And yet, as she returned to her small studio apartment and resumed her daily routine, she told herself it had been just an encounter, a fleeting intersection between two worlds. He was a billionaire entrepreneur. She was a freelance designer still trying to rebuild her footing. People like him didn't remember people like her. On Tuesday morning, as she sipped her coffee and scanned through client emails, a new message caught her eye. The subject line read simply, "From the office of Ethan Vale." Her hands froze mid-air for a heartbeat before she opened it. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Vale asked that we reach out regarding a potential design collaboration. If you're available this Thursday at 10 a.m., he would like to meet in person at Vale headquarters downtown Miami. Warm regards, Clara Devlin, executive assistant to Mr. Ethan Vale." Sophia reread the message 3 times, heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she wondered if it was some kind of prank, the sort of harmless mischief Rachel might pull just to make her smile. But the email address was official, the tone unmistakably professional. She set her mug down carefully, afraid even a small movement might shatter the fragile disbelief holding her still. She called Rachel immediately, and when her friend answered, Sophia's words came out in a rush. "Rachel, I just got an email from Ethan Vale's office. He wants to meet me. This Thursday. About a collaboration." There was a beat of silence before Rachel exploded. "You're kidding. Sophia, that's incredible. I told you that night was a turning point. You made an impression, probably the only woman in that entire crowd who didn't throw herself at him." Sophia laughed nervously. "I wasn't trying to make an impression. I was just trying not to cry." Rachel's tone softened. "And that's exactly why he noticed you. You were real. Authentic. Go to that meeting, Soph. Dress like you already belong there because you do." Thursday morning came like a storm of nerves and adrenaline. Sophia woke early, unable to eat, her mind rehearsing every possible scenario. What if she said something foolish? What if he didn't even remember her? What if she simply wasn't good enough for whatever project he had in mind? But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her on the yacht, not with judgment but curiosity and respect. That memory anchored her as she chose her outfit. A cream-colored blouse tucked into tailored navy trousers, subtle gold earrings, and a soft bun that framed her face. Professional, elegant, not ostentatious. The Vale Industries headquarters towered above the downtown skyline like a glass monolith, reflective, sophisticated, and quietly intimidating. Inside, the lobby stretched into a cathedral of light, filled with living greenery and minimalist furniture. The receptionist greeted her warmly and directed her to the top floor. As the elevator ascended, Sophia caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, poised but trembling slightly, the same mix of hope and fear that always preceded something life-changing. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that was unlike any corporate office she'd ever seen. The upper floor was designed like a modern art gallery. Open concept, filled with natural light with walls displaying digital prototypes of luxury yachts and architectural renderings. At the far end, a glass office overlooked the city and the endless blue of the Atlantic beyond. Inside stood Ethan Vale, speaking quietly with a woman who must have been his assistant. He turned as she approached, and the moment their eyes met, Sophia felt the tension ease just a fraction. He smiled. Not the polished, performative smile of the rich and powerful, but something genuine, understated. "Miss Martinez," he said warmly, stepping forward to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, matching his tone as best she could. His handshake was firm but kind, the same warmth she remembered from that night on the yacht. He gestured for her to sit in one of the sleek white chairs across from his desk. "I'll be honest," he began, settling into his seat. "I don't usually get personally involved in selecting interior designers. My team handles those decisions. But after what happened on the yacht, and after I saw your portfolio, I wanted to speak with you directly." Sophia felt a flutter of uncertainty. "I appreciate that. I wasn't sure if you'd even remember me." His expression softened. "I remember people who stand their ground with grace. You didn't let him break you that night. That told me more about your character than any resume ever could." She felt a rush of color in her cheeks, unsure how to respond. He continued, "I'm developing a new project, something different from my usual ventures. A private retreat on a secluded island off the Florida Keys. It's intended to be a sanctuary, minimalistic, sustainable, but emotionally warm. A place that feels human, not industrial. My architects have handled the structure, but I need someone who can make it breathe. Someone who understands the balance between space and soul." His eyes locked on hers. "That's you, Ms. Martinez." For a long moment, Sophia couldn't speak. The scope of the opportunity was staggering. A private island resort owned by one of the wealthiest men in the country. It was the kind of project that could redefine a career. I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "Say yes," Ethan said simply, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'll have my legal team send you the brief and a confidentiality agreement. You'll work directly under me for the initial phase, and if it goes well, we'll move to full contract. Does that sound acceptable?" Sophia took a steadying breath, her mind spinning with disbelief and gratitude. "Yes, absolutely. Good." He leaned back slightly. "I should warn you, I can be demanding when it comes to vision. But I value honesty. If something doesn't feel right, I want to hear it. I don't hire people to agree with me." She nodded. "Then we'll get along just fine." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement, maybe admiration. "I have a feeling we will." The following weeks became a blur of sketches, concept boards, and long days spent at Vale headquarters. Ethan had assigned her a corner studio with panoramic views of the bay, stocked with everything she needed: drafting tables, digital modeling tools, and even a small espresso bar that made her laugh when she discovered it. "I figured you'd need caffeine for inspiration," he'd said when she thanked him, his tone casual but his eyes gleaming with quiet pride at her enthusiasm. Working with him was unlike any collaboration she'd ever experienced. Ethan had an engineer's precision but an artist's heart. He didn't dictate ideas. He questioned them, pushed her to think deeper. When she showed him her first concept, an open living pavilion inspired by ocean currents and sunlight movement, He studied it in silence for several minutes before finally saying, "It feels alive, like it breathes with the tide." Sophia smiled. "That's exactly what I wanted," he nodded. "Then you're on the right path." Their meetings often stretched late into the evening, the office quiet except for the hum of the city below. Sometimes they'd pause for coffee breaks, and she'd learn fragments of his story, how he'd grown up in a working-class family, built his first prototype boat in his father's garage, and nearly gone bankrupt twice before his company took off. There was humility in the way he spoke, not the rehearsed modesty of the successful, but the grounded awareness of someone who had fought his way through failure. And though he was guarded, there were moments, fleeting, unintentional, when she glimpsed something softer beneath his stoic exterior. The way his gaze lingered when she laughed, the way he listened, truly listened when she spoke about color theory or emotional design. She found herself thinking about him long after leaving the office, replaying their conversations, wondering if he felt that same quiet current pulling between them. But she reminded herself constantly, this was work. This was her second chance. She couldn't afford to lose focus. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, Sophia was gathering her things when Ethan appeared at her door. He leaned lightly against the frame, his sleeves rolled up, the faint exhaustion of a long day etched across his features. "You've been here every night this week," he said, his voice low and almost teasing. "Do you ever stop?" "Not when I'm inspired," she replied, smiling. "Besides, I'm making up for lost time." He stepped inside, glancing at the layout pinned across her wall. "It's more than design, isn't it? For you, it's healing." His words hit too close to home. She looked down, tracing the edge of her notebook. "Maybe. I guess creating beautiful spaces helps me remember that broken things can still become something whole." Ethan studied her quietly for a moment before saying, "I understand that more than you think." When she met his eyes, something passed between them, a silent recognition of shared scars. Then he smiled faintly and gestured toward the city lights. "Come on, you've earned a break. There's a little rooftop cafe 2 blocks from here that serves the best late-night espresso in Miami. My treat." Sophia hesitated, torn between caution and the undeniable warmth of his offer. "Are you sure? I wouldn't want to cross any professional lines." He chuckled softly. "It's just coffee, Ms. Martinez. I promise not to discuss design principles unless you insist." She laughed, the tension melting. "All right, Mr. Vale, coffee it is." As they stepped into the cool night air, the city glittering around them, Sophia realized something profound had shifted. For months she had lived in survival mode, afraid to hope, afraid to feel. But now, standing beside the man who had seen her strength before she'd rediscovered it herself, she felt something stirring deep within. Not romance yet, but renewal. A sense that life, after all its storms, was offering her a second sunrise. Weeks melted into months, and the island project that had begun as a sketch on Sophia's table slowly evolved into a living masterpiece. Every morning she woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, the kind that made her heart beat faster even before she opened her eyes. Her apartment, once a quiet cage of memories, was now filled with rolls of drawings, fabric swatches, and digital prototypes. The air smelled of fresh coffee and ocean salt from the samples she brought back from the construction site. It wasn't just work anymore. It was transformation. And somewhere in that transformation, Ethan had become an inseparable part of the rhythm. The partnership between them had settled into an easy, unspoken harmony. Ethan's vision was always sharp, his ideas driven by logic and functionality, while Sophia brought warmth and emotion to the spaces. He would speak in terms of structure, sustainability, and technology. She would counter with feelings, atmosphere, and human experience. Together they created something that felt balanced. His mind and her heart weaving a design language neither could have achieved alone. When they worked side by side, hours passed without either noticing. Sometimes they would argue fiercely over color palettes or the placement of natural lighting, but their debates always ended the same way, with respect, laughter, and quiet understanding. One humid afternoon, Sophia and Ethan stood at the edge of the island construction site, watching workers assemble the skeletal framework of the main retreat pavilion. The sun burned low in the sky, casting molten reflections over the waves. Sophia adjusted her hat against the glare, her eyes tracing the graceful curves of the structure. "It's strange," she said softly, "seeing something that started as a pencil line become real." Ethan turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "That's the reward of vision. Most people give up when all they have is a sketch. You didn't." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I almost did, you know, after the breakup. I kept thinking maybe Trevor was right, that I was just small-scale material." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "You're not small, Sophia. People who belittle others usually do it because they're terrified of their own insignificance." She looked at him, caught off guard by the depth in his tone. "You sound like you've lived that." He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I have. When I started Vale Industries, investors laughed at me, said I was dreaming above my means. Even my business partner left before our first prototype launched. The day the first models sank during testing, I stood on the dock and thought I'd ruined my life. But failure teaches you the kind of hunger success can't." Sophia studied him quietly, realizing that beneath the polished exterior and wealth, he carried scars just as deep as hers, different in shape but carved by the same blade of doubt. "I guess we both had to fall apart to build something better." He turned to meet her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The air was charged, not with words, but with a stillness that made her pulse quicken. Then Ethan's voice softened. "Maybe that's why this project works. It's not about perfection. It's about rebuilding." A distant sound broke their moment. Rachel's voice calling from the dock, announcing the arrival of the interior shipment. Sophia blinked, the spell broken, and stepped back. "I should check the textiles before the humidity ruins them," she said, her tone brisk to hide the trembling in her voice. Ethan nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he turned toward the engineers. That night, back in her apartment, Sophia found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazy circles in the dark. She replayed every word of their conversation, every glance that had lingered too long, every silence that had felt too heavy. She had promised herself not to blur boundaries. Ethan was her employer, her collaborator, her mentor in ways she hadn't expected. But lately it had become impossible to ignore the quiet ache that bloomed in her chest whenever he smiled. It wasn't infatuation. It was connection, the kind that grows slowly, like roots spreading beneath the surface before you even notice they're there. The next morning, as she entered the Vale headquarters, the air in the building buzzed with excitement. The island retreat had begun attracting attention from investors and journalists eager to cover Ethan's first emotional design project. Clara, Ethan's assistant, met Sophia in the lobby with a bright smile. "Mr. Vale's waiting for you in the boardroom. He said it's important." Sophia's heart gave a nervous thump. Inside the boardroom, Ethan stood by the window, sunlight spilling across his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable at first, but then he smiled faintly. "I wanted you here for this," he said, gesturing to a small group of executives seated around the table. "We're finalizing the public launch announcement for the retreat. I want you listed as the lead designer, not a contractor." Sophia froze. "Wait, you mean publicly? As in press coverage?" "Exactly," he said. "You deserve the credit. This project carries your soul more than mine. It's time people saw that." The words landed like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. For years she'd worked in the shadows, her contributions quietly absorbed under company names or client egos. Now one of the most influential men in the city was offering her the recognition she had never dared to demand. Her throat tightened. "Ethan, I thank you. I don't even know what to say." He gave a small smile. "You already said it with your work." As the meeting continued, Sophia found herself watching him from across the table, noticing the way he commanded attention without dominating it, the way he valued every person's input. Confidence without arrogance, something Trevor had never understood. When the meeting ended, she lingered as the others left. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, and for once there was no businesslike barrier in his expression. "Because I see what you can become," he said simply. "And because you've reminded me why I started building in the first place." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I used to build to prove myself," he admitted. "Now I build to create meaning." You reminded me that design isn't just structure. It's emotion. That's something I lost along the way. For a moment, neither spoke. The city outside glimmered in the afternoon light, and the air between them felt alive, filled with something unnamed yet unmistakable. Then Ethan stepped back, clearing his throat. You should get some rest, Sophia. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She nodded, smiling faintly, though her heart was anything but calm. That weekend, the first wave of journalists arrived on the island for a private preview tour. Sophia stayed behind at the headquarters to prepare presentation materials. Late that afternoon, while she was finalizing design renders, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Well, look who's moved up in the world, came a voice she hadn't heard in months, smooth, smug, and instantly recognizable. Trevor. Sophia's stomach tightened. What do you want? Relax, Soph. I just wanted to congratulate you. Saw the press release. Looks like your little design hobby finally got an upgrade. His tone dripped sarcasm. Must be nice having a billionaire patron. Tell me, is he as generous as they say? Her hands clenched into fists. Don't call me again, Trevor. Whatever satisfaction you're getting from trying to undermine me, it's wasted. Oh, come on, he chuckled. Don't play innocent. People talk. They're saying the project's success has more to do with your charm than your talent. You really think Vale picked you just for your designs? Sophia's vision blurred with anger. You don't get to define my worth anymore, she said sharply, and hung up before he could reply, but his words stuck, festering like poison. That evening, she found it difficult to concentrate. Doubt whispered at the edges of her mind. The same doubt Trevor had fed her for years. What if people really thought that? What if her reputation became just another rumor in the glossy gossip circuits of Miami? She knew how cruel that world could be. When Ethan returned from the island the next day, he immediately noticed something in her demeanor. You seem quiet, he said as they reviewed the latest schematics. Just tired, she murmured. He studied her for a long moment, then set his tablet aside. Sophia, don't lie to me. Something's wrong. She hesitated, then sighed. It's stupid. Someone called me Trevor. He said people are spreading things about us, about how I got this job. Ethan's expression darkened. And you believe them? No, she said quickly, then faltered. I don't want people to think I earned this because of you. He took a slow step closer, his voice steady but fierce. Listen to me. You earned everything here through talent and grit. Let them talk. Let them choke on their own pettiness. You owe no one an explanation. The conviction in his tone broke something inside her, a fragile wall she'd built to protect herself from believing too deeply in anyone again. Tears welled unbidden, and before she could turn away, Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly against her shoulder. Sophia, he said quietly, don't let the ghosts of small minds steal your fire. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that gaze she saw everything she'd been searching for. Respect, faith, and something softer, deeper, something that frightened her as much as it warmed her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Ethan stepped back as if reminding himself of the line neither had dared to cross. Take the weekend off, he said gently. Go to the ocean. Clear your head. But that night, as Sophia sat by her apartment window watching the lights of the city shimmer like 1,000 tiny promises, she realized something had changed. What she felt for Ethan was no longer something she could ignore or rationalize away. It wasn't just admiration. It was something real, dangerous, and undeniable. And though she didn't yet know it, the days ahead would test not only her heart, but everything she had rebuilt from the ruins of her past. The first hint that triumph and trouble were arriving together came with the morning light, and with it a headline that moved through Miami like electricity. Sophia woke to the vibration of her phone walking across the nightstand, the screen, filling with messages from numbers saved and unknown, from clients she adored and acquaintances she barely remembered, from Rachel in all caps, and Clara with her professional calm. An online magazine had run a glossy feature on Vale Industries' Revolutionary Island Retreat, celebrating its sustainable materials and emotion-forward design language. And then, in a separate, gossip-tinted piece, it paired that praise with a film strip of paparazzi images that told a different story. There was Sophia in a dark blazer, stepping out of the Vale headquarters near midnight. Ethan 2 steps behind her, the telephoto lens compressing the distance and transforming space into implication. There they were again, a week earlier, sharing espresso at a rooftop cafe, her smile unguarded, his attention focused, a candid with no context framed as a narrative. The caption did not accuse Miami's gossip, never accused, but it invited readers to connect dots they were handed like candy. It suggested softly, the way rumor does when it wants to appear innocent, that professional brilliance and personal proximity might be fused. It was clever and it was cruel, and as Sophia scrolled, a flush rose from her collarbone to her cheeks. She could almost hear Trevor's smug whisper in the back of her mind. People talk. She forced herself to breathe the way she'd learned to. Breathe through overwhelm, slow in, slower out, then called Rachel, who answered on the first ring with the kind of battle energy that could level a stadium. "I saw it," Rachel said, no hello, her voice already moving into solutions. "Listen to me. You don't respond. You don't post. You don't dignify insinuations with a conversation. We stay steady, we control what we can, and we bring the attention back to the work. The story dies when the clicks do." Sophia closed her eyes, grateful for the anchor of that voice even as anxiety tightened its loops around her ribs. "I'm okay," she lied, "because part of bravery is not letting your fear make the first sound. I just hate the idea that the team could think—" She didn't finish the sentence, she didn't need to. Rachel's exhale softened. "The people who matter already know the truth. The rest of them aren't your clients and they're not your friends. Get dressed, go to the office, and keep building the one thing no headline owns, your reputation." By the time Sophia reached Vale headquarters, Clara had already assembled a quiet plan. A short, dignified statement would be released if necessary. One, that said nothing about personal lives and everything about the project's mission, the materials sourced, the artisans paid, the reef-safe construction methods that had required 6 months of negotiation with conservationists. But when Sophia stepped into the glass-walled studio, it wasn't Clara's composure that steadied her. It was Ethan standing at her drafting table, sleeves rolled, eyes gentler than she'd ever seen them, the man who could command rooms now choosing to speak softly. "We don't feed fires," he said before she could say a word. "We build walls that keep them from reaching what matters." She laughed once, humorless, but grateful. "Walls," she said, tapping the flat elevation of the ocean pavilion. "That I can do." He studied her face with the kind of attention that said he understood the part of her she wasn't showing, then simply nodded, as if they had made a pact cresting under words. Work became the only medicine they trusted. They drove out to the island twice that week, riding the Dawn in a chartered skiff instead of the usual executive launch, meeting the carpenters as the first light lifted the palms out of shadow. Sophia walked the sand barefoot to feel the temperature, gradient, warm slurry by day, cool breath at night, and took notes about thermal comfort and the way morning wind funneled between the two pavilions. She adjusted louvers by 5 degrees on the south face to coax breeze without inviting glare. She shifted the seating radius in the gathering hall by 8 inches so silhouettes wouldn't cut across each other in late afternoon sun. She asked the stone mason to scuff the limestone surface by 1 additional pass so it would hold the memory of bare feet and time. In those choices there was sanctuary, a way to belong to something larger than the narratives projected onto her. And as the plan grew more precise, the noise in her head thinned like fog over water. But storms rarely announce themselves at the edges. They show up in the center of what you've built. The first sign arrived as a set of invoices that didn't match the samples on site, followed by a delivery of engineered plank flooring that looked correct at a glance but felt wrong under the palm. Too slick, too regular, a manufactured shine that betrayed the natural oaks they had specified. Sophia knelt on the subfloor, running her fingers across the grain like a reader tracing a scar, and felt the lie in it. She asked for purchase orders, then chain of custody certificates. The subcontractor responsible produced documents that, to anyone else, would have seemed sufficient, but to Sophia were off by a nuance. The ink density on the supplier's mark, the date code that didn't match the kiln season. It was small enough to pass, big enough to matter. She looked up at Ethan, who had crouched beside her, the two of them breathing sawdust and decision. "If we let this in," she said quietly, "we teach the building to imitate instead of to belong." He nodded once, eyes going cold in the way they did when something violated the covenant of the work. "Reject the lot. Audit the chain. Shut off payment until we know every name and every truck in this line." The audit revealed exactly what Sophia feared, and more than Ethan would tolerate. A mid-tier supplier had cut a deal to substitute lower-grade material with a cosmetic finish, the paperwork padded and the margins sweetened for anyone willing to look away. When the project manager traced the calls, the thread led, like a bad rumor always does, to a familiar surname: Ashford. Trevor wasn't on a single official document. He didn't need to be. He had friends, and those friends had learned there were dollars to be made if Vale Industries could be embarrassed. If the story could become that the island retreat was a beautiful facade on a hollow core. It wasn't enough to hurt the building. The ambition was to hurt the idea of it. The discovery tightened every muscle in Ethan's jaw, but his response wasn't the rage Sophia had seen burn through lesser men. It was something colder and more surgical. He didn't call Trevor. He called his legal team, then the bank that underwrote the supplier's line of credit, then the environmental oversight body that had granted the project its conditional approvals. He gathered people at the table who didn't need persuasion to care about integrity, and then he asked Sophia to do the hardest thing designers ever do: to explain to executives in plain language why the soul of a space could be killed by a compromise a spreadsheet would call negligible. She spoke without slides, standing in a room of men and women accustomed to numbers, and she told them that materials weren't just surfaces, that every choice was a signal to the human nervous system, that a floor that faked honesty would teach every person who stepped on it to be a little less at ease and not know why. She told them that the retreat's promise was not luxury but trust, in craftsmanship, in the land, in the way a room asked you to breathe. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when they're making a decision that will cost money and make meaning. Ethan looked at her as if he were seeing the blueprints of a cathedral no one had dared draft. "We hold the line," he said to the group, and nobody argued. The supplier was removed within 48 hours, their contract terminated for cause, the replacement source flown in from North Carolina with wood stacked like hymns. The gossip blogs lost interest for a day or two in the absence of new photographs, and that should have been the end of one fire, but storms are greedy. 2 evenings later, as the team prepared a private walkthrough for a handful of early investors, Sophia received a message from a blocked number containing a single sentence and a file. "Might want to know how your name is being used." And then a PDF, a mock invoice template carrying her digital signature, authorizing consulting fees to a shell entity that cross-referenced to one of the supplier's front companies. It was crude, but it was enough to poison a conversation if released into a feed. Her pulse stumbled, and for a beat she stood completely still, the city lights of downtown Miami blurring into a smear beyond the studio glass. She had learned in these months how not to be afraid of work. She had not yet learned how not to be afraid of being smeared. She took the file to Clara first because calm is an art, and Clara practiced it like prayer. Together they reviewed metadata, traced the font substitutions, the signature vector's jagged aliasing, the odd mismatch between the time zone encoded in the file and the office's default settings. "It's fabricated," Clara concluded, but her voice carried the measured pace of someone who knows that truth and perception are cousins who don't always speak. "We can prove it, but not fast enough to prevent damage if it leaks. We need to get ahead by being bigger than the blow." Sophia nodded, a line of steel rising inside her where panic had first burned. "Then let me speak," she said. "Let me face this while it's still rumor." The next afternoon, in a move that felt both terrifying and inevitable, Sophia stood at the edge of the gathering hall under construction, hard hat in hand, in front of a semicircle of investors and community partners. The ocean breathed behind them, and the scent of lime and cedar lifted from the unfinished walls like a promise. She did not address the gossip or the file directly. She told the story of the retreat again, but this time she braided into it the story of accountability. She explained the audit and the rejected wood. She gave credit to carpenters by name. She said that the building would open when and only when it could welcome guests without apology. The heart we're making here can't thrive on shortcuts, she said, her voice level, her palms open at her sides. And if you ever see my name on a document that erodes that heart, you will know it is a forgery before you ask me a single question. There was a murmur then, a ripple of something like respect, followed by the sound of Ethan's hands coming together once, twice firm and unambiguous. Others followed, the applause not showy, more like a quorum arriving at itself. When it quieted, an investor in a linen jacket raised his chin and said, "That's why I wrote my check," and at that, Sophia felt the knot in her chest loosen a knot she hadn't realized was there. That evening, the two of them remained on the island after the last skiff left, walking the lantern-lit paths between the pavilions while the tide came in. Work crews had gone, the machines were silent, and the stars were out in a way the city never allows. Ethan didn't speak at first. He simply matched his steps to hers across the cool, clean limestone she had insisted on, the night air salted and forgiving. When he finally stopped, it was at the edge of the waterline where tiny waves etched soft signatures in the sand and then smoothed them away. "You protected something today that doesn't have a voice," he said, hands in his pockets, gaze on the horizon. "You did it knowing there was a cost. I won't forget that." She laughed softly, tired and warmed by the way he said it. "I wasn't brave," she replied. "I was just unwilling to be small." He turned then, and the look he gave her was not the look of a mentor or an employer, or even a friend. It was simply human and unarmored, full of gratitude and the ache of recognition. The distance between them felt like a question that had been asked for weeks and finally deserved an answer. Sophia's heart moved first, then her feet. She stepped closer because the quiet had asked her to, because some lines are only noble when they keep harm out, not when they keep truth apart. But as she reached him, Ethan's breath caught and he lifted a hand, not to touch but to ask. "If I cross this," he said gently, "I don't want it to be because a bad week made us look for a soft place to land. I want it to be because the work we've made together taught us we could trust what comes next." She stood very still, then nodded once, relief rushing in where disappointment could have. "Then we wait," she said, and the word did not feel like loss. It felt like respect, like framing done right before the walls rise. He exhaled, a sound like gratitude, and together they stood without touching, listening to the water fold itself and unfold, building patience like a structure that could carry weight. Waiting did not mean idling. The days that followed were a study in focus. Rachel orchestrated a portfolio release showcasing Sophia's pre-veil projects in a way that told a story of continuity rather than sudden ascent. Clara coordinated quiet conversations with two design editors who cared more about material honesty than party photos. Ethan doubled down on transparency with suppliers and invited the conservation group to write a public memo on reef-safe methods. Trevor tried predictably to bait a response with a sleek text that read, "You clean up well when a man hands you a stage." But when Sophia saw his name on the screen, she felt, finally, cleanly, nothing at all. She blocked the number and deleted the thread, closing a door that had been ajar in her spirit far longer than she'd realized. The retreat approached its soft opening with the kind of calm earned by hard choices. On the last inspection walkthrough, Sophia moved through each space the way a pianist runs their hands above the keys before the first chord, eyes tracing lines, breath feeling the room's temperature, body listening for friction. The sea pavilion held shade like a blessing and light like a sigh. The bathhouse, clad in hand-troweled plaster, felt cool even at noon. The library, with its low shelves and wide sills, invited reading and then sleep. She paused in the gathering hall and watched a gust of warm breeze lift the edge of a linen drape, the fabric whispering against wood, and for a moment she saw all the people who would stand here later, tired travelers exhaling, couples leaning shoulder to shoulder without knowing why it felt safe to be quiet, solitary hearts rediscovering their own pace. This, she thought, is the point. Not the press, not the pictures, not even the applause. This sense that a building can make you more yourself. On the morning of the soft opening, with guests arriving by small boats and the hospitality team adjusting flowers one last time, Ethan found Sophia on the path between the palm grove and the entry, her hard hat replaced by a simple scarf, her eyes bright not with adrenaline but with steadiness. He stopped in front of her and for a few seconds simply looked, And it was the look of a man memorizing something true. "No statements," he said quietly, almost smiling. "No defenses. Just the doors opening." She nodded, unsuspecting of the detail he had held back, which revealed itself an hour later in the courtyard when he welcomed the first group with a few words about vision and craft and community, and then called her name, not as a contractor, not as the lead designer, but as the co-creator of the retreat. The syllables folded into the morning air and were met with a sound that began as clapping and rose into something warmer, less performative, like agreement. She felt the heat rise behind her eyes and didn't fight it. She stepped forward, shook one hand, then another, and in that tide of congratulations, she let go of the last remnants of a story that had once kept her small. After the guests dispersed to their bungalows and the courtyard quieted to the pleasant murmur of first impressions, Sophia and Ethan slipped into the boardwalk shade where mangroves stitched their roots like delicate hands. He stood a moment with his shoulder against a post, the way men do when they are very tired and very proud. "I meant what I said," he told her. "Co-creator. This place exists the way it does because you insisted it carry a pulse." She wanted, in that instant, to step into the place between his words and say the thing they had both been circling for weeks, but instead she gave him the thing that faith demands before words. Time. "Then let's keep protecting it," she said, and he laughed softly. That quiet relief that sounds like rain at last, and yet the world loves symmetry. And so the story that had begun with humiliation on a deck and a stranger's intervention now bent toward a moment that would mirror it. Not with spectacle, but with clarity. A week later, at a modest evening reception for the craftspeople whose hands had turned drawings into a place people could touch, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the lantern light. His smile a weapon dressed up as charm. Someone had invited Trevor because someone always invites a man like that. His firm was tangled in too many deals to exclude without a political price. He approached with his glass held like a gavel and said, just loud enough for the small ring of listeners to hear, that success looked good on her, that this must be what happens when one aligns talent with very generous mentorship. The air around them tightened into a cruel expectation. Sophia felt for a fraction of a beat the old surge of heat at her collar, that reflex that comes when you are called small in public. But this time she did not look for rescue and she did not rehearse fury. She lifted her chin and said in a voice that carried to the edges of the courtyard, that generosity had indeed played its part. The generosity of craftsmen who refused shortcuts, of a team that held the line, of a community that demanded accountability. She thanked the carpenters by name again. She nodded to the mason. She lifted her glass to the woman who had insisted on reef-safe mortar. Then she turned to Trevor and with a gentleness that struck harder than scorn, said, and when some of us ran out of generosity, we learned to rely on integrity instead. The ring of listeners broke into laughter that was not cruel but freeing. And Trevor, seeing the room no longer available to his theater, chose retreat. He moved to the periphery, discovered that the periphery did not love him either and left early. No one followed. No one photographed it for a feed. It was better than a headline. It was closure conducted in the native language of dignity. Later that night, standing again at the water's edge where waves unmade their own lines, Sophia felt Ethan come up beside her. His presence the comfort of a chair that fits your back perfectly. They didn't speak for a while. They let the sound of the retreat at rest tell them what they needed to know. When he finally did speak, it was not with flourish but with the care of someone setting a fragile thing where it belongs. "I'm ready to cross that line," he said simply. "Not because it's been a hard week, but because the work is strong enough to carry it, and because I don't want a future in which I pretended what I feel is just gratitude." She didn't answer right away. She let his words settle where fear used to live. And when she turned to him, her smile was not astonishment or even triumph. It was recognition. "Then let's build it the way we built this," she said. "Slow, honest, with the grain." He nodded, a breath catching between relief and joy. And though they still did not hurry anything, though they still kept the work first and the gaze outward, they let their hands find each other, quietly without announcement, like a door smoothly fitting its frame after many patient adjustments. The island slept. The lanterns hummed and Miami's echo was far away. The storm had asked what they were made of, and the answer, finally, was not rumor or resistance, not even resilience. The answer was craft. It was choosing the right wood when the wrong wood would have shown more. It was correcting tiny angles of light so a tired heart could rest. It was the refusal to trade meaning for speed and the courage to stand in a courtyard and decline the old script. As the tide touched their shoes and then pulled back, Sophia realized with a calm that felt like morning that the girl who once drew quietly in a rented apartment had not been replaced by this woman beside a man with a famous name. She had simply come home to herself. And when Ethan lifted their joined hands to kiss her fingers, not possessive, not performative, just a vow between two people who had learned to wait, she understood that part 5, whatever it would bring, would not ask whether she was enough. It would ask what they could make together when enoughness was no longer the question. The retreat opened to the world under a sky so blue it looked new, as if even the weather had decided to start again. The soft launch had been calm and local. The grand opening brought the full constellation of journalists, investors, artists, and dreamers who wanted to be seen beside beauty, and, secretly, to borrow a little of its permanence. Sophia had spent the night before walking every pathway one last time with a notebook and a flashlight, checking that no lantern was misaligned, that each light cast the right warmth, that the scent of the sea carried clean through every open corridor. When dawn broke, she watched the first rays touch the limestone walls and turn them honey gold. And for a heartbeat she could not believe this was hers. Not owned, but authored. She remembered how she had once stared at a coffee cup in a rented apartment and believed her life had collapsed inward. Now the same hands that had trembled holding that cup had drawn something that would outlast her. The guests arrived in waves of color and chatter, women in linen dresses and men in rolled sleeves, the sort of crowd that measured success by how effortless it looked. Ethan handled the introductions with his usual grace, never claiming the spotlight but always steering it toward purpose. When he spoke, he didn't list features or costs. He talked about stewardship, about how a building could teach the people inside it to respect what surrounded them. When he gestured toward Sophia, calling her the voice of the island's soul, she felt a ripple of warmth move through the crowd, a collective turning toward her that no longer felt like exposure, but like sunlight. For the first few hours, everything unfolded perfectly. The journalists loved the tactile balance of wood and stone. Investors admired the return forecasts hidden behind the poetry of sustainability, and guests wandered through the villas with their phones raised but fell quiet when the spaces hushed them. Even Rachel, pragmatic to the end, stood by the infinity pool with tears slipping down her cheeks, murmuring, "You did it, Soph. You built something that makes people breathe differently." Sophia laughed through her own tears and pulled her friend into an embrace that held every sleepless night and every moment of doubt between them. Ethan joined them a moment later, his suit jacket gone, his sleeves rolled in that familiar, uncalculated way. "Everything you touched works," he told Sophia, his eyes bright with pride that didn't hide behind professionalism. "Even the wind listens to you." She smiled and shook her head. "It listens to us," she corrected. "We just learned to stop forcing it." Their conversation drifted naturally into easy rhythm, small jokes about the chaos of logistics, half-finished sentences the other could complete. Around them, the celebration unfolded, but for Sophia it felt like moving inside a calm center while the world spun outward. By late afternoon, the event shifted to the shoreline for the ceremonial ribbon cutting. A small platform had been built at the edge of the boardwalk, decorated with white orchids and coral accents. Ethan stood beside her as cameras clicked, and a local mayor gave his predictable speech about innovation and economy. When the time came, they cut the ribbon together, their hands steady on the silver scissors. The applause rose and faded, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of waves against the sand. It was official now. The island had a heartbeat, and it would carry their names side by side into whatever came next. After the crowd drifted toward the reception tents, Ethan stayed behind, looking out over the water. Sophia joined him without words, slipping off her shoes to feel the wood under her bare feet. For a long time neither spoke. They watched the sun fold itself toward the horizon, the light turning from gold to amber to the deep, forgiving tone of evening. Finally, Ethan said, "I used to think success would feel like arrival. Now I see it feels more like beginning." She turned to him, her hair lifting in the breeze. "Then where do we begin?" He smiled faintly. "Wherever you want to go." They talked then, not of contracts or architecture, but of what came after. Her plan to open her own design studio focused on affordable, sustainable interiors for small urban homes. his desire to mentor young engineers from communities like the one he'd grown up in. There was a gentleness in the conversation, a recognition that ambition was not the enemy of peace but its companion when balanced correctly. He told her that she made him remember that buildings were meant to shelter hearts, not just bodies. She told him that he taught her ambition didn't have to be arrogance, it could be precision shaped by purpose. As the reception wound down, a quiet rain began to fall, light at first, then steadier, soaking the sand in silver. Guests laughed and scattered beneath canopies, but Sophia and Ethan stayed where they were, letting the rain soak their clothes, cool on warm skin. He looked at her through the curtain of drops and said softly but without hesitation, "I love you." The words were not dramatic. They were deliberate, built with the same integrity as every beam and wall around them. For a moment she could only stare, the sound of the rain folding the silence between them into something holy. Then she stepped forward, close enough that the words didn't need to travel far. "I love you too," she whispered. "Not because you saved me that night, but because you never tried to own what you helped me find." He reached for her then, and the kiss that followed wasn't cinematic or watched. It was human and true, the meeting of two people who had already seen the worst of themselves and chosen to build anyway. The rain fell harder, the sea rose louder, and somewhere behind them Rachel cheered through tears before retreating to give them privacy. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing quietly, Ethan brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. "This," he said, "is the only headline that matters." Weeks later, when the island was running smoothly and Sophia had signed the lease for her own studio in downtown Miami, she stood in the empty space surrounded by white walls and sunlight and thought about beginnings again. She could still smell sawdust and salt in her memory. She could still hear Ethan's voice from their morning calls, encouraging, teasing, proud. The gossip that had once tried to define her had evaporated into irrelevance, replaced by invitations to speak at design forums and mentor programs. Yet none of that was what she carried as her victory. What she carried was the quiet certainty that she had rebuilt her life from the foundation up, one honest choice at a time. On the day she opened the doors to her studio, Ethan arrived unannounced holding 2 coffees and a small carved plaque. It was a piece of driftwood from the island smoothed by the tide, engraved with 4 words, "With the grain, always." She traced the letters with her fingertips, tears threatening again. "You remembered," she said. "I built an entire life to never forget," he replied. That evening they walked along Biscayne Bay, the city lights rippling on the surface like liquid glass. They spoke of future projects, of travel, of the idea of someday building something together again. Not for investors, not for headlines, but for people who needed spaces that healed. And when they fell quiet, it wasn't out of fear or uncertainty. It was because silence had finally become a language they both understood. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ocean and rain. Sophia closed her eyes and let it move through her hair, through the last echoes of who she had been before all this began. She thought of the girl who had once been humiliated on a deck under the watchful eyes of strangers, who had felt smaller than her own voice, and she smiled, not at vengeance, not at victory, but at transformation. That girl had not vanished. She had simply evolved, sanding herself smooth against the roughness of experience until she could reflect light again. Ethan reached for her hand, their fingers interlocking like the beams of a structure that had passed every stress test life could design. "What happens now?" he asked. She looked toward the horizon, where the last glow of sunset met the dark edge of the sea. "Now," she said, "we keep building. Not palaces, not islands, just places that make people feel safe enough to dream again." And as the night gathered around them, as the world beyond Miami buzzed with stories and screens and endless noise, Sophia Martinez, the woman who had once been measured against someone else's definition of worth, walked forward into the quiet future she had drawn herself. Her steps aligned, her heart steady, her name no longer an echo of heartbreak but a blueprint for grace.